The merchant's fingers pressed into the boy's shoulder, testing muscle density like a butcher evaluating meat. Around them, the slave market of Rome buzzed with casual commerce. Pottery vendors hawked their wares, women bargained for vegetables, children played between the stalls, and in the center of it all, human beings were bought and sold with the same indifference as livestock. This is the story of what happened to those boys. Not the sanitized version you learned in school, where slavery was just an unfortunate footnote in Rome's glorious history. This is the raw, documented reality of children whose lives were measured in coins, whose futures were decided by profit margins, and whose humanity was systematically stripped away by an empire that perfected the art of human commodification. Today, we're going inside the most disturbing aspect of Roman civilization. The systematic exploitation of young slave boys that turned children into products, innocence into profit, and human potential into entertainment. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this story has been buried in academic footnotes, and why modern historians prefer to discuss Roman architecture instead of Roman atrocities. But before we dive into the horrifying details, let me give you some context that will make everything else make sense. Rome wasn't just casually cruel to slaves. They industrialized human suffering with the same efficiency they brought to engineering and warfare. What you're about to hear isn't random brutality. It's systematic dehumanization perfected over centuries. Picture this scene from a slave market in 150 CE. A Germanic boy, maybe 14 years old, stands naked on a wooden platform while potential buyers examine him like merchandise. His wrists are bound with rope that's already chafed his skin raw. His eyes dart between faces in the crowd, searching for mercy that doesn't exist. The auctioneer's voice carries over the forum as he lists the boy's attributes. Strong back for heavy labor. Good teeth indicating decent health. Young enough to be trained properly. The language strips away every trace of humanity, reducing a child to a collection of useful body parts and economic potential. A merchant steps forward, running practiced hands along the boy's arms and legs. He's done this hundreds of times before. He knows exactly what to look for. Muscle development that suggests the child can handle physical work. Scars or deformities that might affect value. Signs of disease that could represent a bad investment. The bidding starts at 50 denarii, about 2 months' wages for a common laborer. The price of a human life reduced to mathematical calculation. Buyers raise their hands with the same casual interest they'd show for a promising horse or a well-crafted tool. 60 denarii, 70. The boy's value climbs as men who've never known a day of hardship decide his worth. His future hangs on economic forces he can't understand, controlled by people who see him as nothing more than a business opportunity. Here's what makes this particularly disturbing. The buyers weren't monsters. They were ordinary Roman citizens, respected members of society, men who went home to their families each night, who participated in religious festivals, who considered themselves civilized people. The normalization of human trafficking was so complete that buying a child generated no more moral concern than purchasing grain or olive oil. The winning bid comes in at 90 denarii. The buyer, a middle-aged Roman named Marcus, has plans for this particular investment. He runs a workshop that produces pottery for the growing middle class. Young hands are perfect for the detailed work that makes his products valuable. Small fingers can reach into narrow spaces. Quick reflexes can prevent costly breakage. But Marcus has other uses in mind too. The boy is attractive in the way that wealthy Romans appreciate. Those blue eyes and blonde hair that mark him as exotic, foreign, different. In a culture that fetishizes youth and power over the powerless, a beautiful slave boy represents multiple forms of value. As coins change hands, the transaction becomes official. The boy now belongs to Marcus in the same way that Marcus owns his furniture or his livestock. Roman law makes no distinction. Slaves are property, subject to whatever use their owners desire. The branding comes next. A red-hot iron pressed into tender flesh, marking ownership as permanently as a cattle brand. The boy's scream cuts through the market noise, but no one stops their business. This is routine. This is normal. This is Rome. The letter M burns into his shoulder, identifying him as Marcus's property for the rest of his life. The smell of charred skin mingles with the market's everyday scents. Fresh bread, spices, leather goods, creating a nauseating blend of commerce and cruelty. The boy gets a new name too. His Germanic identity dies in that moment, replaced with something Roman, something that marks him as foreign but owned. Let's call him Servus, though thousands of slave boys carried similar names. Servus meaning servant, meaning property, meaning nothing more than function. The journey to Marcus's workshop takes them through Rome's bustling streets. Servus sees free children playing, laughing, running to their mothers. The contrast between his fate and theirs becomes crystal clear. Citizenship, that accident of birth, means everything in Rome. It's the difference between person and property, between future and commodity. Marcus's workshop sits in a busy commercial district. The building is well-maintained, prosperous-looking. From the outside, you'd never guess the horrors that happen within its walls. But that's how systematic exploitation works. It hides behind respectable facades and economic necessity. Inside, Servus meets the other slaves, boys ranging in age from 10 to 16, all bearing the brand of ownership, all carrying the hollow look of children who've learned that hope is dangerous. They work in silence, hands moving with mechanical precision, shaped by months or years of brutal conditioning. The work itself might seem harmless to modern eyes, shaping clay, painting designs, loading kilns. But it's the conditions that reveal the true nature of Roman slavery. 14-hour days without breaks, meals consisting of thin gruel and stale bread, sleeping arrangements that pack children into airless rooms like cargo. The psychological warfare starts immediately. Servus learns that talking during work earns a beating. Looking directly at Marcus or his free workers earns punishment. Any sign of defiance, any hint of the person he used to be, brings swift and brutal correction. But the physical abuse, horrible as it is, pales compared to the systematic destruction of identity that defines Roman slavery. Servus is forbidden from speaking his native language. His memories of home are dismissed as irrelevant fantasies. Everything that made him who he was gets stripped away piece by piece until only function remains. The other boys teach him the unwritten rules through whispered conversations after dark. Never show pain during punishment. It only makes masters hit harder. Never form close friendships. They'll be used against you. Never dream of freedom. That way lies madness. Marcus has refined this system over years of owning children. He understands that broken spirits produce better workers than broken bodies. A slave who's given up hope won't try to escape. A child who's forgotten his name won't remember his homeland. The psychological chains prove stronger than any iron shackles. The economic calculations behind this cruelty are precise and deliberate. Servus cost 90 denarii to purchase. His daily food costs about half a denarius. His labor produces pottery worth roughly 3 denarii per day. Within 2 months, he'll have paid for himself. Everything after that is pure profit. But Marcus has bigger plans than simple pottery production. Young slave boys serve multiple functions in Roman households, and not all of them involve manual labor. The empire's wealthy class has developed appetites that require fresh supplies of vulnerable children, and Marcus knows exactly how to satisfy those markets. The transformation from person to product is nearly complete. Within weeks of his purchase, Servus moves through his tasks with robotic efficiency. His hands know their work without conscious thought. His eyes stay fixed on the ground. His voice, when he's permitted to speak at all, carries the flat tone of someone who's learned that emotions are dangerous luxuries. This is what Rome perfected. Not just the ownership of human beings, but their complete psychological reconstruction. The empire didn't just want workers, they wanted willing participants in their own exploitation. Children who would thank their masters for the privilege of serving, who would compete with each other for scraps of approval, who would forget they were ever meant to be anything more than tools. The system worked because it was comprehensive. Every aspect of Roman society reinforced the idea that some humans were naturally inferior, naturally suited for servitude, naturally deserving of whatever treatment their betters decided to provide. Religion sanctified it. Law codified it. Economics rewarded it. Culture celebrated it. But we're just getting started with the story. What happened to Servus in that pottery workshop was only the beginning, because Roman slavery had specialized branches that made ordinary domestic servitude look merciful by comparison. Some boys were destined for the mines where life expectancy was measured in months. Others faced the gladiator schools where they'd be trained to kill for entertainment. Still others disappeared into the private chambers of wealthy Romans. Their fate too disturbing for most historians to discuss in detail. The machinery of human exploitation that defined Roman civilization operated on a scale that dwarfs most modern atrocities. Millions of children torn from their families, branded like cattle, and transformed into commodities for an empire that built its glory on systematic suffering. In our next part, we'll follow Servus deeper into this nightmare. We'll see what happens when Roman efficiency meets Roman cruelty. We'll witness the specific techniques used to break young minds and reshape them for profit. And we'll discover why this story has been sanitized, hidden, and forgotten by a modern world that prefers its history lessons comfortable and clean. Because the truth about Roman slavery isn't just disturbing, it's a mirror that reflects uncomfortable questions about human nature, systematic evil, and how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when the system makes it profitable and socially acceptable. The boy who entered that slave market as a person left as property, but his journey into the heart of Roman darkness was just beginning. The workshop's daily rhythm became Servus's new reality, but rhythm suggests something natural, organic. This was mechanical precision designed to extract maximum value from human machinery. The bronze bell that woke them at dawn wasn't just a timekeeper. It was psychological conditioning, training their bodies to respond automatically to Roman commands. Picture the morning routine that would define the next years of his life. 43 slave boys ranging from 10 to 17, all jerking awake at that first bell clang. No gradual awakening, no moment to remember dreams of home. Just immediate transition from unconsciousness to labor because dreams were luxury items that slaves couldn't afford. They had exactly 12 minutes to relieve themselves in the communal latrine, splash cold water on their faces, and line up for inspection. Marcus understood that rushed routines prevented contemplation. Boys who barely had time to think couldn't plot escape or rebellion. The schedule wasn't about efficiency, it was about mental control. The inspection itself revealed Rome's genius for a systematic dehumanization. Marcus would walk the line, examining each boy like a general reviewing troops. Except these weren't soldiers. They were investments requiring daily maintenance checks. Hands examined for cuts that might slow pottery work. Eyes checked for signs of sickness that could spread through the workforce. Bodies assessed for the subtle changes that indicated a child was approaching the age where different uses might prove more profitable. Here's what most people don't understand about Roman slavery. The cruelty wasn't random or emotional. It was calculated business practice refined over centuries of human ownership. Every aspect of their lives was designed to maximize economic return while minimizing the costs of rebellion or replacement. The work assignments followed mathematical logic that reduced children to production units. Smaller hands worked on delicate painted details because their fingers could navigate narrow spaces. Stronger boys lifted and carried because their muscle development suggested higher load capacity. The newest arrivals got the most dangerous jobs near the kilns because their inexperience made them expendable during the adjustment period. But it was the psychological manipulation that truly showcased Roman sophistication in human exploitation. Marcus had learned that competition between slaves increased productivity while preventing solidarity. Boys who saw each other as rivals for limited privileges couldn't unite against their oppressor. The food distribution system exemplified this calculated cruelty. Instead of equal portions, Marcus allocated meals based on daily performance. The most productive workers got adequate nutrition. Average performers received subsistence rations. Anyone who failed to meet quotas watched others eat while their own stomachs cramped with hunger. This created a vicious cycle that destroyed natural human compassion. Boys would sabotage each other's work to secure better food portions. They'd report minor infractions to curry favor with overseers. They'd celebrate when rivals were punished because it meant improved standing in the workshop hierarchy. Servus learned these lessons through brutal experience. His first week, he helped another boy whose clay pot had cracked during firing. The gesture cost him his evening meal and earned him 10 lashes for wasting time on someone else's failure. The message was crystal clear. Compassion was weakness, and weakness threatened survival. The beating itself deserves detailed examination because it illustrates how Romans perfected punishment as educational tool. Marcus didn't just hit Servus, he made the other boys watch, explaining each blow's purpose as it landed. This lash teaches you not to waste time. This one reminds you that his failure isn't your concern. This final strike ensures you remember whose property you are. The other boys' faces during this lesson revealed the system's true horror. Not shock or sympathy, but careful attention. They were taking notes on how to avoid similar punishment. Servus's suffering became their education in survival through selfishness. Sleep brought no relief from this psychological warfare. The sleeping quarters were designed to prevent privacy or personal reflection. 43 boys packed into a room built for 20, lying on thin straw mats that provided no comfort and little warmth. Bodies pressed against bodies in forced intimacy that destroyed any sense of personal space or individual identity. The darkness filled with whispered conversations, but not the kind you'd expect from children. These weren't bedtime stories or shared dreams. These were tactical discussions about work quotas, punishment avoidance, and advancement opportunities within their captivity. The system had corrupted even their dreams, turning sleep into another arena for competitive survival. Marcus employed older slaves as enforcers, boys who'd been in the workshop for 3 or 4 years and had internalized its values completely. These weren't overseers in the traditional sense. They were products of successful conditioning, living examples of what total psychological surrender looked like. One boy, maybe 16, had achieved the coveted position of floor supervisor. He moved through the workshop with authority that came from complete identification with his oppressor's interest. He'd learned to see through Marcus's eyes, measuring other slaves' value in terms of productivity and compliance. His reward was slightly better food, marginally improved sleeping arrangements, and the intoxicating power to inflict the same suffering he'd endured. This represented Rome's greatest innovation in human exploitation. They didn't just break slaves' bodies or spirits, they rebuilt them as willing participants in their own oppression. The supervisor boy genuinely believed his elevated status reflected his superior worth. He'd forgotten he was property and started thinking like an owner. The workshop's daily production quotas revealed the mathematical precision behind Roman cruelty. Each boy was expected to complete specific tasks within exact time frames. Fall short, and punishments followed with mechanical inevitability. Exceed expectations and rewards materialize just substantial enough to encourage continued overperformance. But here's the truly diabolical aspect. The quotas were calibrated to be barely achievable. Most boys could meet them on good days when their hands worked smoothly and materials cooperated. But bad days, when clay cracked or paint smeared or kilns ran too hot, created automatic failure that justified punishment. This wasn't accidental. Marcus had calculated that intermittent failure kept slaves in constant anxiety about their performance. Boys who always succeeded might become confident. Those who always failed might give up entirely. But slaves who succeeded most of the time while living in fear of failure worked with desperate intensity that maximized production. The economic incentives extended beyond simple labor extraction. Marcus had developed additional revenue streams from his human inventory that revealed Roman slavery's true scope. Wealthy customers would pay premium prices to borrow attractive boys for private entertainment. The workshop's location near the theater district wasn't coincidental. These arrangements generated more profit than pottery sales, but they came with costs that couldn't be measured in coins. Boys who returned from such encounters carried damage that went far beyond physical injury. They'd learned that their bodies belonged to whoever could afford the rental fee, that their pain was just another commodity in Rome's vast marketplace of human suffering. The psychological impact created 2 types of survivors. Some boys withdrew completely into themselves, performing their tasks with mechanical precision, while their consciousness retreated to places that couldn't be reached by Roman hands. Others embraced their commodification entirely, competing for the privilege of being selected because it offered brief escape from workshop drudgery. Both responses served Marcus's purposes perfectly. Withdrawn slaves caused no trouble and worked reliably. Eager slaves generated higher rental fees and created competition that prevented solidarity. Either way, the system extracted maximum value from their humanity while destroying everything that made them human. Marcus kept detailed records of each boy's performance, rental history, and behavioral patterns. These weren't personal observations, but business documents tracking assets' depreciation and profitability. Boys were evaluated like livestock, their declining value carefully monitored to optimize replacement timing. The records revealed patterns that would shock modern sensibilities, but seemed perfectly natural to Roman business practices. Most boys remained productive for 18 to 24 months after purchase. Physical development and psychological adjustment initially improved their value, but extended exploitation inevitably led to diminishing returns. Some boys broke down entirely, becoming liabilities that cost more to maintain than they produced. Others aged out of their primary market value, becoming suitable only for basic labor that barely covered their upkeep costs. The most successful adapted so completely to their commodification that they became valuable long-term investments. Marcus had plans for his most successful products that extended far beyond pottery production. The Roman economy had created specialized markets for trained slaves that offered higher profit margins than simple manual labor. Boys who demonstrated intelligence might be educated for administrative roles. Those with artistic talent could be developed into decorative craftsmen. The most psychologically malleable could be groomed for positions requiring absolute loyalty and discretion. But these opportunities came with their own forms of horror. Education meant learning to use their intelligence in service of their oppression. Artistic development required channeling creativity into productions that celebrated Roman power. Positions of trust demanded complete identification with masters' interests, even when those interests involved perpetuating the same system that had destroyed their own childhood. The workshop had become a factory for manufacturing compliant victims, and Servus was learning that survival required participating in his own destruction. The boy who'd entered the slave market with hope of eventual freedom was discovering that freedom itself was just another Roman luxury that slaves couldn't afford to want. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in the systematic elimination of human dignity, and Servus would learn that this workshop was merely the first circle of a much larger hell that Rome had created for children, unfortunate enough to be born without the protection of citizenship. The wooden post stood 6 feet tall, wrapped in leather that had been stained dark by countless training sessions. Servus gripped the practiced gladius, its weight unfamiliar in hands that had known only pottery tools. Around him, 20 other workshop boys faced identical posts, their faces masks of concentration and barely contained terror. This was graduation day at Marcus's workshop. Not the kind that celebrated achievement, but the kind that separated profitable investments from disposable failures. The boys who showed promise with weapons would be sold to gladiator schools for triple their original purchase price. Those who couldn't adapt would find themselves in Rome's mines, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. The trainer, a scarred former gladiator named Gaius, demonstrated the basic thrust with mechanical precision. His voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd learned that emotional distance was the only way to survive training children to kill. Step forward, drive the blade, recover position. Simple movements that would either save their lives or end them in spectacular fashion for Roman entertainment. The mathematics behind this selection process revealed Rome's genius for extracting value from human suffering. A boy purchased for 90 denarii could be resold to a gladiator school for 300 if he showed potential. Those same economics meant that boys who failed this test weren't just worthless. They were expensive mistakes that needed to be disposed of quickly. Servus thrust his wooden blade at the leather-wrapped post, feeling the impact jar through his thin arms. The movement felt wrong, alien, nothing like the delicate fingerwork that pottery demanded, but wrongness didn't matter anymore. Only profit margins mattered, and boys who couldn't generate them faced fates that made workshop slavery look merciful. The training revealed how Romans had systematized violence into educational curriculum. Each movement was broken down into components that could be taught, measured, and improved. Footwork patterns that created optimal striking angles, blade positions that provided maximum protection, breathing techniques that conserved energy during extended combat. But this wasn't really about teaching boys to fight. It was about identifying which ones possessed the psychological makeup that gladiator schools valued. Raw aggression could be channeled and refined. Natural fear could be overcome through conditioning. But certain mental qualities, the ability to kill without hesitation, the capacity to perform violence as entertainment, these couldn't be manufactured. They had to be discovered. Gaius walked among them, making notes on a wax tablet that would determine their futures. His assessments weren't based on skill that could be developed over months of brutal training. He was evaluating temperament, searching for boys who showed the right combination of desperation and adaptability that made profitable gladiators. The selection criteria revealed disturbing insights into Roman understanding of human psychology. Boys who cried during training were marked as unsuitable. The arena demanded performers who could suffer in silence. Those who helped struggling companions were likewise eliminated. Gladiatorial combat required absolute selfishness. Even boys who showed too much natural ability were sometimes rejected because they might develop confidence that interfered with total obedience. What Gaius wanted were boys who were broken just enough to be moldable but not so damaged that they couldn't function. The perfect gladiator candidate was desperate for approval, terrified of punishment, and completely dependent on his trainers for any sense of worth. These psychological profiles have been refined through decades of experimentation on children's minds. The evaluation process lasted 3 hours, but for the boys it felt like an eternity. Each thrust, each defensive movement, each moment of hesitation was being recorded and analyzed. They weren't just learning to use weapons. They were auditioning for the right to die in public for Roman amusement. Marcus observed from the workshop's entrance, calculating potential returns on his investments. Boys selected for gladiator training would generate immediate profits through their sale. Those rejected would be liquidated through Rome's other slave markets, mines, galleys, or private households where the remaining value could be extracted before their inevitable disposal. The economic logic was flawless from a Roman perspective. Every boy purchased represented potential profit that could be realized through various channels. Workshop labor provided steady returns. Gladiator training offered high-value resale opportunities. Even if failure had monetary value, like rejected boys could still perform manual labor until their bodies gave out completely. Servus felt Gaius's eyes evaluating him as he attempted the defensive patterns. His movements were clumsy, untrained, but something in his stance caught the trainer's attention. Perhaps it was the way he maintained eye contact despite his fear. Maybe it was how he continued practicing even when his arms burned with exhaustion. Whatever quality Gaius recognized, it sealed Servus's fate with mathematical certainty. The announcement came at sunset, delivered with the same casual indifference Romans showed for all business transactions. 12 boys had been selected for gladiator school placement. Their names were read from Gaius's tablet like a shipping manifest, reducing human destinies to inventory management. Servus heard his name called and felt something inside him die. Not hope. He'd learned better than to maintain that luxury. What died was his last connection to the boy who'd played in Germanic forests before Romans made him property. That child was gone forever, replaced by a potential gladiator whose value would be measured in blood spilled for entertainment. The selected boys were separated from the others that night, housed in a different section of the workshop to prevent contamination of attitudes. Those destined for the mines didn't need to know about gladiatorial glory. Those heading to arena school shouldn't dwell on alternatives that might make them less eager to please their new owners. The psychological preparation began immediately. Gaius spoke to them about honor in combat, about earning crowd approval through skillful killing, about the possibility of winning freedom through exceptional performance. Every word was carefully chosen to rebuild their identities around violence and spectacle. But the veteran trainer's private thoughts, recorded in documents discovered centuries later, revealed the cynical reality behind these inspiring speeches. He knew that fewer than 1 in 50 gladiators ever earned manumission. He understood that most would die within 2 years of entering the arena. His job wasn't to prepare them for success, it was to make them eager to participate in their own destruction. The boys who weren't selected faced their own form of graduation. Before dawn, they were loaded onto wagons bound for various destinations throughout the empire. Some would dig silver in Spanish mines until their lungs filled with stone dust. Others would row galley ships until their hearts burst from exertion. The luckiest would serve in households where they might live long enough to see their hair turn gray. Marcus conducted these transactions with the efficiency of someone disposing of spoiled inventory. Each rejected boy represented a loss that needed to be minimized through quick liquidation. Their original purchase prices couldn't be recovered, but cutting losses quickly prevented additional feeding and housing costs from accumulating. The economic calculations extended beyond simple profit and loss accounting. Marcus had to consider the psychological impact on his remaining inventory. Boys who witnessed mass disposals might become demoralized and less productive. But those who saw successful placements in gladiator schools might work harder, hoping for similar opportunities. The balance required careful management of information and expectations. Selected boys were celebrated and honored before their departure, creating the impression that gladiator training was a reward for excellence. Rejected boys simply disappeared overnight, their absence explained as transfers to better opportunities elsewhere. This systematic deception represented another Roman innovation in slave management. Rather than relying on pure brutality to maintain control, they had learned to manipulate hopes and fears with surgical precision. Slaves who believed improvement was possible worked harder than those who had nothing left to lose. The night before the gladiator candidates were to be transferred, Marcus addressed them personally. His speech mixed paternal affection with business pragmatism in ways that revealed how completely Romans had normalized the commodification of children. He spoke of being proud of their development, of having high expectations for their future performance, of maintaining interest in their careers as they brought honor to his workshop's reputation. Every word reinforced the fundamental lie that defined Roman slavery, that their suffering served some greater purpose, that their exploitation benefited them somehow, that their masters genuinely cared about their welfare rather than simply managing valuable assets. The boys absorbed these messages because they desperately needed to believe their lives had meaning beyond mere commodity status. The alternative, accepting that they were nothing more than entertainment products being prepared for consumption, was too psychologically devastating to contemplate. As dawn approached, the selected boys were fitted with traveling chains that would transport them to their new owners. The iron shackles weren't just physical restraints, but psychological markers of their transition from one form of property to another. They were graduating from workshop slavery to arena slavery, from private exploitation to public spectacle. The wagons that would carry them to gladiator schools were already loaded with other human cargo. Boys from workshops throughout Rome, all selected for their potential to die entertainingly in front of crowds. The systematic nature of this collection process revealed how thoroughly Romans had industrialized the transformation of children into killers. Servus climbed into the wagon with mechanical obedience, his mind already beginning the psychological adjustments that would help him survive whatever came next. The boy who'd entered Marcus's workshop still dreaming of home was gone. In his place sat a potential gladiator, ready to be shaped into whatever form would generate the most profit for his new owners. The journey to the gladiator school would take 3 days, traveling through countryside where free Roman children played in their families' fields. The contrast between their lives and his would be visible through the wagon's barred windows, a constant reminder of what citizenship meant in an empire built on the systematic exploitation of those unlucky enough to be born without it. But Servus no longer thought about such comparisons. Survival required focusing only on immediate necessities, following orders, avoiding punishment, and preparing mentally for whatever training awaited him. The larger questions about justice, freedom, and human dignity had become dangerous luxuries that slaves couldn't afford to consider. The wagon wheels began turning, carrying their human cargo toward training facilities that would complete their transformation from children into weapons. Behind them, Marcus was already calculating the profits from their sale and planning the purchase of new boys to replace them in his workshop's relentless production cycle. This was how Rome's machinery of human exploitation operated with perfect efficiency, turning children into commodities, commodities into entertainment, and entertainment into profits that funded the purchase of more children. The cycle was complete, sustainable, and utterly without mercy for those caught within its grinding mechanisms. The gates of the ludus loomed ahead like the mouth of some stone beast, their iron teeth designed not just to contain bodies but to devour souls. As the wagon carrying Servus and 11 other boys approached the Gladiator school, the sounds from within painted an audio portrait of systematic brutality. Steel ringing against steel, grunts of pain and exertion, the sharp crack of wooden training swords against flesh and bone. This wasn't just another destination in their journey through Roman slavery. This was the final factory in Rome's assembly line of human destruction, where boys were stripped of their last traces of humanity and rebuilt as killing machines, programmed for public entertainment. The economics were simple and horrifying. Transform children into gladiators, gladiators into spectacle, spectacle into profit. The ludus master who greeted them at the gates had the look of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of breaking young minds. His name was Lucius Brutus Magnus, and his scarred face told stories of his own survival in the arena before transitioning to the more profitable business of manufacturing other people's deaths. "Fresh meat," he announced to his assistants, examining the new arrivals with the clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating livestock. His eyes moved over each boy, calculating potential, measuring probable lifespan, assessing entertainment value. These weren't children to him. They were raw materials requiring processing before they could generate revenue. The first lesson came before they'd even left the wagon. A boy named Gaius, maybe 15, made the mistake of looking directly at Brutus Magnus during the inspection. The ludus master's response was swift and educational. His fist connected with the boy's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt, while the others learned their first rule through observation rather than experience. "Eyes down, mouth shut, ears open," Brutus Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd refined intimidation into science. "You're not people anymore. You're investments. My job is to make you profitable before you die. How long that takes depends on how quickly you learn to stop being human." The entrance ritual stripped away their last connections to individual identity. Their hair was shaved completely, removing even the texture and color that marked their ethnic origins. Their remaining clothes were burned in a ceremonial fire that served both practical and psychological purposes. Lice prevention was the stated reason, but watching their last possessions turn to ash drove home the finality of their transformation. New clothes were issued with mathematical precision. Each boy received identical garments. Rough wool tunics dyed the brown of dried blood, leather sandals that provided protection without comfort, and, most significantly, iron collars that marked them as gladiatorial property. The collars weren't just identification tags, but psychological tools that made escape impossible and submission inevitable. The sleeping quarters revealed the ludus's approach to human storage. 40 boys packed into a stone room designed for 20, their sleeping mats arranged with the efficiency of a warehouse storing breakable goods. Privacy was forbidden, personal space non-existent, individual comfort irrelevant to the machinery of mass murder production. But it was the training schedule that revealed Rome's true genius for systematic dehumanization. Dawn to dusk, every moment planned, every activity designed to replace human instincts with gladiatorial programming. They weren't learning to fight. They were learning to stop being boys and start being weapons. The wooden training swords felt different here than they had in Marcus's workshop. Heavier, more purposeful, weighted to build specific muscle groups that would serve specific killing functions. The targets weren't simple posts, but humanoid figures designed to teach accurate placement of fatal strikes. Every practice thrust was aimed at vitals, every defensive movement calculated to protect areas that needed to remain functional for extended combat. The trainers were all former gladiators who'd survived long enough to transition from entertainment to education. They understood the psychology of transformation because they'd experienced it themselves. Their teaching methods combined technical instruction with systematic brutalization, designed to rewire young nervous systems for violence. Servus learned that hesitation was the deadliest enemy a gladiator could face, not because it led to defeat in combat, but because it indicated retention of human conscience. Boys who hesitated before striking were subjected to punishments that made them associate mercy with agony. Those who struck without thinking were rewarded with better food, warmer sleeping arrangements, and the intoxicating approval of their trainers. The medical examinations revealed another layer of Roman efficiency and human commodification. Every boy was assessed for specific physical advantages that could be developed into marketable fighting styles. Tall boys with long reach were trained as spearmen. Quick, smaller boys learned net and trident techniques. Those with powerful builds became heavy infantry specialists. But the examinations went beyond simple physical assessment. Roman physicians had developed techniques for evaluating psychological suitability for different types of combat. Boys who showed natural aggression were channeled toward styles that maximized their bloodthirsty potential. Those who demonstrated intelligence were taught tactical approaches that could extend their arena careers. Even fear was evaluated and categorized. Some boys fought better when terrified, others needed confidence to perform effectively. The food distribution system at the ludus represented psychological warfare disguised as nutrition management. Meals weren't just about keeping gladiators alive, but about creating hierarchies that prevented solidarity. New boys received minimal rations that kept them hungry and desperate. Advanced students earned better food through superior performance. Veterans who'd proven their entertainment value dined on meals that approached adequacy. This created competition that destroyed any possibility of unified resistance. Boys would sabotage each other's training to secure better feeding positions. They'd report infractions to trainers hoping for improved treatment. They'd celebrate when rivals were punished because it meant advancement in the ludus hierarchy. The system turned potential allies into enemies, ensuring that rebellion remained impossible even when opportunity presented itself. The punishment protocols revealed Roman innovation in applied psychology. Rather than relying on random brutality, the ludus employed calculated consequences designed to modify behavior with scientific precision. Boys who showed mercy during training faced punishments that associated compassion with suffering. Those who displayed individual thinking were subjected to treatments that made conformity feel like salvation. The most effective punishments weren't physical, but social. Boys who violated rules found themselves isolated from the group, denied the minimal human contact that made their existence bearable. Others were forced to endure public humiliation that stripped away dignity more completely than any beating. The message was clear. Individual identity led to individual suffering, but submission to the group offered protection and belonging. The training weapons graduated from wood to blunted metal to razor-sharp steel as boys proved their readiness for increasingly lethal instruction. Each transition marked another step away from humanity toward weaponization. The steel felt different in their hands, not just heavier but somehow alive with potential for destruction. Advanced students demonstrated techniques on live prisoners, condemned criminals who served as practice targets for developing gladiators. These weren't training exercises, but educational executions designed to desensitize boys to the reality of killing human beings. The prisoners' screams became background noise, their blood just another mess to clean up after lessons ended. Servus watched his first demonstration execution with stomach-churning horror that gradually transformed into clinical interest. The trainer's blade found its mark with surgical precision, ending life with an efficiency that seemed almost artistic. By the 10th demonstration, he was taking notes on technique rather than fighting revulsion at the spectacle. The psychological transformation was accelerating now, each day bringing him further from the boy he'd been and closer to the killer he was becoming. His dreams, when exhaustion allowed them, featured increasingly violent scenarios where he was the predator rather than prey. His hands moved through sword patterns even while sleeping, muscle memory overriding conscious control. The ludus employed former gladiators as counselors, whose job was to help boys process their transformation from human to weapon. These weren't therapy sessions, but programming workshops designed to rebuild identity around violence and spectacle. Boys learned to see themselves as artists whose medium was death, performers whose audience craved blood, heroes whose glory came through superior killing technique. The counseling sessions revealed how thoroughly Romans understood the psychology of systematic dehumanization. Boys who clung to memories of home were taught to view their past as weakness that needed to be overcome. Those who mourned their lost families were shown how attachment led to hesitation that led to death. Individual personality traits were reframed as flaws that interfered with optimal performance. Religious instruction complemented the psychological programming, teaching boys that their fate was divinely ordained and their suffering served cosmic purposes. The gods, they learned, demanded blood sacrifice to maintain universal order. Gladiators were holy warriors whose deaths in the arena pleased divine powers and protected Rome from cosmic chaos. This theological framework provided meaning for meaningless suffering, purpose for purposeless destruction. Boys who might have rebelled against simple slavery found themselves embracing their role as sacred killers whose blood would sanctify Roman entertainment. The transformation from victim to volunteer was nearly complete. The Ludus operated multiple programs simultaneously, processing boys with different potentials through specialized tracks. Some were destined for elaborate spectacles requiring months of choreographed preparation. Others would serve as cannon fodder, expendable opponents whose quick deaths would highlight star performers' superior skills. The most promising would receive years of intensive training that might, if they survived long enough, lead to fame and the distant possibility of freedom. But survival statistics told their own story about the reality behind these promises. Records maintained by the Ludus revealed that fewer than one boy in 20 lived long enough to see his 18th birthday. Most died during training, their bodies unable to withstand the systematic brutalization required to create effective killers. Those who survived training faced even worse odds in actual arena combat. The mathematical precision of these mortality rates wasn't accidental but carefully calculated. The Ludus needed to maintain optimal ratios between training investment and profitable return. Boys who required too much instruction before becoming arena-ready represented poor investments. Those who died too quickly after completing training wasted educational resources. The sweet spot involved creating gladiators who lived just long enough to generate maximum entertainment value before their inevitable destruction. Servus was learning these calculations through direct observation as older students graduated to arena combat and younger boys arrived to replace those who'd died during training. The constant turnover created an atmosphere of perpetual transition where forming attachments was both impossible and dangerous. Everyone was temporary, everyone was replaceable, everyone existed solely to feed Rome's appetite for organized human destruction. The realization that he was becoming complicit in his own dehumanization struck him during his third month at the Ludus. He found himself critiquing other boys' technique rather than sympathizing with their struggles. He felt pride when trainers praised his progress rather than horror at what that progress represented. He was competing for better treatment rather than looking for opportunities to resist or escape. The system was working perfectly, transforming a boy who'd once played in Germanic forest into a willing participant in Rome's machinery of death. The psychological chains were stronger than any iron shackles because he was learning to forge them himself, link by link, choice by choice, until escape became literally unthinkable. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in the art of killing, and Servus would embrace them with the enthusiasm of someone who'd learned that cooperation with his destroyers was the only path to survival in a world where humanity itself had become a luxury that slaves couldn't afford to maintain. The arena floor felt different beneath his feet than the training sand of the Ludus. This wasn't practice anymore. The roar of 50,000 Romans pressed down on him like a physical weight, their bloodlust so thick he could taste it in the air. Servus gripped his gladius, its familiar weight now feeling strange in hands that trembled not from fear but from something worse. Anticipation. 3 years of systematic brutalization had accomplished what Rome intended. The boy who'd once wept for his homeland now felt his pulse quicken at the crowd's savage approval. Their chants of his arena name, Ferox the Germanic beast, sent electricity through his nervous system more powerful than any drug. He'd become addicted to the very thing that would destroy him. His opponent emerged from the opposite gate, a Thracian fighter with the desperate look of someone fighting his first professional bout. Servus recognized that expression because he'd worn it himself not long ago. Now he saw it through Predator's eyes, calculating weaknesses, measuring the distance to victory. The transformation was complete. The editor's signal dropped, and combat began. But this wasn't the clumsy desperation of two terrified boys anymore. Servus moved with lethal precision, his body executing techniques that had been burned into muscle memory through endless repetition. Every strike had purpose. Every defense flowed into counterattack. He'd become exactly what Rome wanted, a perfect killing machine disguised as entertainment. When his blade found its mark, the crowd exploded in approval that flooded his system like molten gold. 50,000 voices screaming his name, showering the sand with flowers and coins, treating him like a god. For those precious moments, he wasn't property anymore. He was somebody. He mattered. The addiction had him completely. Victory brought rewards that made the horror almost bearable. Better food, warmer quarters, women who competed for the attention of arena favorites. Merchants sold oil lamps bearing his likeness. Children played with wooden figurines carved in his image. He'd achieved a twisted form of immortality, his face mass-produced for Roman consumption, even as his body accumulated damage that promised an early grave. The medical examinations after each bout revealed the arithmetic of his destruction. Torn ligaments that would never fully heal, microfractures that weakened bones with each impact, brain trauma from repeated head blows that caused tremors in his sword hand. His body was paying interest on a debt that could only be settled with death, but the crowd's worship made it feel worthwhile. Each cheer validated his suffering, transformed his pain into purpose. He'd learned to crave their approval more than freedom, their attention more than dignity. Rome had accomplished something more insidious than simple slavery. They'd made him grateful for his chains because they came with applause. The economic calculations behind his fame were precise and profitable. Gate receipts increased when Servus fought. Betting odds shifted based on his condition. Sponsors paid premium prices to associate their names with his victories. He'd become a brand, a marketing phenomenon, a profit center that generated wealth for everyone except himself. 43 fights. That's how many times he'd killed for Roman entertainment, each victory making him more valuable and less human. The boy who'd entered the slave market for 90 denarii was now worth thousands, his price rising with every drop of blood he spilled in the sand. But the mathematics of gladiatorial combat were inexorable. Reflexes slowed by fractions, strength diminished by degrees. The accumulated damage finally reached critical mass during his 44th bout against a younger, faster opponent who saw opportunity in Servus's slight hesitation, his barely perceptible tremor. The editor's thumb turned downward with cold calculation. Not mercy or justice, but simple economics. Servus's entertainment value had been extracted. His body had paid its final dividend. Time to liquidate the asset and invest in fresh inventory. As the blade opened his throat, his last coherent thought wasn't of home or freedom, but of the crowd's reaction. Even in death, he craved their approval. The addiction had consumed him so completely that dying felt like disappointing his audience rather than escaping his torment. The cleanup crews worked with practiced efficiency, collecting his blood in cups for sale to epileptics who believed gladiator vitality could cure their afflictions. His flesh would grace aristocratic dinner tables that evening, consumed by the same people who'd cheered his victories. His bones would be ground into powder and sold as aphrodisiacs to aging senators seeking renewed vigor. Nothing was wasted. Every part of his corpse had market value that would be extracted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized his life. The boy who'd cost 90 denarii to purchase generated nearly 2,000 in death, his final contribution to Rome's machinery of human commodification. But the true horror wasn't his individual destruction. It was how quickly he was replaced. Before his blood had dried in the sand, slave traders were negotiating the purchase of fresh boys to feed into the same system. The machinery never stopped, never slowed, never questioned the morality of transforming children into entertainment. The Ludus master counted the profits from Servus's death and immediately reinvested in new inventory. 12 boys purchased with the proceeds, each destined for the same systematic dehumanization that had claimed their predecessor. The cycle was complete, sustainable, profitable, and utterly without conscience. Modern audiences like to believe we've evolved beyond such systematic cruelty. We condemn Roman brutality while consuming our own forms of human destruction. We've simply moved the arenas online and called the gladiators influencers. The mathematics remain the same. Young people destroying themselves for public entertainment, while systems profit from their suffering. The slave markets have become talent agencies. The ludus has become social media platforms. The crowd's bloodlust has become algorithmic engagement. But the fundamental transaction remains unchanged. Human dignity sacrificed for profitable spectacle, individual worth reduced to entertainment value, children transformed into content that feeds society's appetite for systematic destruction. Servus died believing he'd been a warrior, never understanding he'd been livestock. His story isn't ancient history, but eternal warning about what happens when societies normalize the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable for the entertainment of the powerful. The arena never disappeared. It just learned better marketing. The boy from Germania, purchased for 90 denarii and killed for profit, represents millions of children throughout history who've been transformed into commodities by systems that measure human worth in economic terms. His name was erased, his identity destroyed, his humanity reduced to entertainment value. But his story survives as testament to the resilience of individual dignity, even under systematic dehumanization, and as warning about the ease with which ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when the system makes it profitable and socially acceptable. Remember him not as Ferox the Gladiator, but as the Germanic boy who played in forests before Rome taught him to kill for applause. Remember that behind every system of systematic exploitation are individual human beings whose stories matter more than the profits extracted from their suffering. The arena is still with us. The only question is whether we'll recognize it before it consumes another generation of children who deserved better than being transformed into entertainment for a society that confused brutality with civilization. Human dignity isn't negotiable. Individual worth isn't measurable in economic terms, and no amount of systematic normalization can make the exploitation of children acceptable, no matter what name we give it or how we justify it to ourselves. The boy cost 90 denarii. His humanity was priceless. Rome forgot the difference. We must not.